Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my America's Challengers round number 2 overview and analysis video. Man, am I excited to do this. By the end of this one, we are going to know our first team officially eliminated from the playoffs. Our top 3 teams will be remaining, and we will know our first team to qualify for the finals, for grand finals here at America's Challengers, because winners finals is in today's video. Of course, lower bracket round number 1 also in today's video. It felt easier to call it round 2 just as a general video title, but those are the 2 series, of course, that we will be covering. I'm excited to get into it. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. Let me know who you thought was going to win these series and whether or not it went as you anticipated. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts, check out the playlist up in the iCard. That's every single video from America's Challengers every single day covered on this channel in the same format as what you are getting in this video. So if you're interested in what you're seeing here and you want to know, maybe my thoughts on how we got here, that is a great place to start, but certainly not required viewing. Most of today will be spent talking about the games that we saw on the previous day, so let's get right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of the series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of both of the series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will quickly be previewing the semifinals at the end of this, because that's the next upcoming series. It's going to be happening in a couple of hours as of me recording this, but we're still in the best of 3 stage. We have not even entered the best of 5 stage at this tournament yet, so still a lot left to play for. I'm excited. Hope you guys are as well. Without further ado, let's get into the analysis. The first series that we are going to cover is going to be the lower bracket round number 1. That was the first series that happened on the day and is a matchup between the number 2 seeded Fuego and the number 4 seeded VKS Academy. These are 2 of the more interesting teams in terms of how they've performed at this tournament so far against what their expectations were. Fuego certainly overperforming, I think, what a lot of people were anticipating. I don't think a lot of people had a ton of expectations for LATAM coming into this tournament, but they have genuinely been one of the scarier teams. They barely lose in the previous round to Starforge, basically by throwing away a huge lead in game number 1 and then not being able to capitalize down the stretch in game number 3. They probably should be in winners finals in terms of how that series ended up going, but they're not, and so now they have to play for their life here in the lower bracket. VKS are definitely in a bit of a different spot. They went up against their regional rivals in Pain Academy, and for the first time in quite a while, they actually weren't able to take a series against them. In fact, they weren't able to take a game off of Pain. I think a lot of people knew that Pain on paper was the better team. They certainly are more mechanically talented, but VKS has had a really good strategy being able to play through the early game with things like Elise and Yone, that once that was taken away by Pain, once those champions were banned out, VKS just didn't really have the firepower to be able to play through players like Kisei in the same way. So VKS definitely coming into this series with a little bit less momentum. Fuego definitely has more momentum in terms of what we have seen from them in the best of 3s, but on paper, I think you would definitely argue that VKS should be the better team. This is the number 1 seed from the host region, and the region that right now is performing the best at the entire tournament in the CB LOL Academy, and so you would expect this team to be able to figure it out and be favorites in this series, but when you go matchup by matchup, really the matchup that everyone's going to be looking at, rightfully so, is the mid lane matchup, Zelt and Kisei here. I think these are 2 integrally important players to their individual teams. I think Mataz and Zelt are definitely kind of the core of Fuego and how they have played throughout this tournament. Mataz definitely the most important player, at least in terms of, what they have been so far at America's Challengers, but Zelt has been a player that they've, Fuego have done a really good job of trying to get into good positions, and if he's able to team fight efficiently front to back, if Mataz is able to set him up with a lot of his early aggressive plays, then oftentimes Fuego is just in a better spot because of that. But for VKS, they have basically run everything about their game plan through Kisei in the mid lane as well. So I think if they are able to get that early game lead, if they're able to get Kisei in side lanes and get him a ton of resources, get him 2k gold up, they're going to be able to win basically any game. That has been their strategy. And so again, as we've talked about a lot at this tournament, it's going to come down to who ends up winning the early game. I think the snowball effect has been very real at America's Challengers. I think that is just kind of indicative of the teams and the players at the individual tournament. If VKS is going to be able to get those early leads, if things like Elise or Yone fall through draft, I think that's going to be big, but it is still full fearless, which means they will only ever get those champions for 1 game at the absolute most. And so Fuego just needs to be able to kind of take them out of their own comfort zone. Like I said, Fuego, maybe on paper, isn't quite as mechanically talented, but they have performed better at this tournament. So definitely going to be an interesting series, but the only way to know how it ends up working out is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was VKS Academy. They are going to take the first game of this series. Vivo K-Stars look very, very good to kick things off here. And like I said, I kind of expected Vivo K-Stars to be the favorite going into this series. Game number 1 kind of backs that up. They get the Elise and the Yone taken away from them, but there are just too many picks that they can play through in specific roles. And honestly, just a couple of players outplaying their opposition on the side of Fuego. And all of a sudden, VKS is out to an early 1-0 lead in this best of 3. You guys know, I think game 1, probably the most important game of the entire series. Having to win both of the final 2 games is a lot more difficult than only having to win one, and that is now unfortunately the position that Fuego is in. I don't think Fuego played particularly well this game. There were some moments and some pieces that I don't think were horrible. The middle of the map continues to be the strength for Fuego, but like I said, a couple of players just completely outplayed on their side, and I think that is going to be an issue in terms of kind of the expectation for the mechanics of this matchup, and VKS very much capitalizing on that. But let's go ahead and get into my player of the game, which is going to go to Telos in the support position. Felt like he was the most relevant player throughout the entire game. Some of his engages were literally game-winning down the stretch. Him being better than Bala and quite frankly more connected with the rest of his team than Bala was the deciding factor in why this game ended up being so easy. I certainly don't want to underestimate the effects that players like Tyrion or Kisei had on this game, because both of them were great, and we will definitely talk about the Gwen and the Ezreal a bit more as we move along. But watching the tape, it is very clear that the Rel was by far the most important player in this entire game. I talk about this a lot. I talk about cohesion and being on the same timing and page as the rest of your team as a support. Specifically in this meta, I think it's more important right now than it has been in a long time to make sure that whatever play you're making is the play that everybody is on board with, rather than trying to separate your attention and just try to make whatever play you think is best at the time. Unfortunately, that's kind of the problem that Bala fell into in this game, where it felt like a lot of the plays that the Leona was going for didn't feel like the rest of the team was ready to follow up on. That was not the case for Telos on the other side of this matchup, which just created these situations where oftentimes you were getting free picks at the beginning of fights. You would see Leona go in and full stun up the Ezreal, but Telos would just re-engage on the other side of the fight and just completely take away the Corki, take away the Ziggs, and not really allow any sort of follow-up, and all of a sudden VKS is just in a better spot because the Ezreal can now just burst down the Leona and win the fight, with the Gwen being able to kind of separate that front and back line. It just makes things so much easier when your team is a little bit more cohesive in how to follow up on some of these engages, but you do have to give a lot of credit to the support for making those engages happen. Whether or not you want to think that this is more of like a team player of the game because the communication at the end of the day is the reason why this went so well, or if you want to specifically give the credit to Telos, I think that's up to you. But for me, at least, there's no doubting that the Rel was by far the most important champion throughout the entirety of this game. And then again, we have to shout out the solo laners. They were the damage carries throughout all this. Tyrion was exceptional on the top side here on Gwen, constantly dueling ADD. ADD's had an up and down tournament. I thought he played his best series of the entire tournament against Fear in the first round here, but he's kind of struggled. Outside of that, he wasn't very good in the group stage, and Tyrion, I think, has also kind of been up and down, but this definitely was kind of an R5 diff. The Gwen was a bit of a problem that Fuego really didn't have any sort of clean answer to, and that's a problem because the Ezreal's going to be in side lanes, and the 5v5 is already kind of not in your favor, especially if you're losing in gold the way that Fuego was. I mean, they were down 10k gold by the time they were even trying to make some interesting plays at the end of the game, but Tyrion was a big reason for that, being able to generate prio in the mid game. Kisei continues to be an absolute monster. He gets a quadra kill in a fight in this game. Overall, they just are really adept at playing for him and making sure he's in good positions when they do take these 5v5s. Sorolu and Morteus were fine as well, but this was a game where it felt like the Rel was setting everything up for Gwen and Ezreal, and that is a very easy to execute strategy, and that's kind of what you're looking for in a tournament like this. But for Fuego on the other side, just kind of got outplayed. Like I said, the disconnect, the lack of communication, it very much kind of felt real in this one. I haven't necessarily felt that from Fuego throughout the entirety of this tournament, so hopefully that's something that they can kind of lock in on and fix as this series goes along. But Bala is going to get dud of the game for it. Just so many circumstances of the Leona going in without really any sort of backup, and that's just not really acceptable at this stage of the tournament. This was just not a particularly good Leona game. I also think Cassante just got brutalized on the top side of this matchup. The Gwen was 100 times more relevant than the Cassante. We've talked a lot about how Gwen is like this theoretical counter to Cassante. It's always kind of been thrown out there ever since the champion was released. I've pushed back on this idea because I think Cassante has way too many tools to ever be like efficiently countered in that kind of way by a champion like Gwen, but there definitely are, thoughts and credences to the idea that Gwen just shreds him, and he can't really be nearly as aggressive with something like Gwen because she can kind of punish a lot of his mistakes a lot harder than other champions can. So you see Cassante have bad games, every once in a while against Gwen. This was definitely one of them. Mataz, Zelt, Varus, they were along for the ride. I guess Mataz needed to be a lot more active on the Ivern. I don't really like the Ivern in particular for Fuego. It just doesn't really match what Mataz is good at, I would imagine. Obviously, they're going to move to a different style. They can't play Ivern again because of Fearless, but I imagine even just play style-wise, they're going to move to something where Mataz can be a lot more active, and Zelt and Varus were generally whatever. Like, they didn't get to play a lot of this game because of Telos on the other side of this matchup. So positives and negatives overall, I would say, for Fuego. I think that there are definitely still building blocks to build from, and you're not eliminated just yet, but you are on your tournament life right now. It's the last life. You've got nothing left to give. If you lose another game in this series, you are eliminated from America's Challengers, which would obviously be a bit disappointing, but VKS, one game away now from moving on to the semifinals. I'm sure they want to try to get back to the finals, potentially, try to take on Pain, get their revenge there again, take on Fear, be able to be the better purple team at this tournament, whatever narrative you want to try to craft. I think VKS is good enough to be able to get there, but we'll see if they can close it out here in a clean sweep, or if Fuego is going to tie it up and push us to that game number 3. We're going to find out right now, because the winner of game number 2 was Fuego. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and we are going to that game number 3, that deciding game number 3. It is winner take all. Loser goes home in that game 3, so definitely a big one to set up here for Fuego with their tournament lives on the line, and they kind of go for a comp that I think is a bit more familiar to them, but tempo-wise, pacing-wise, really not what I would have expected. Fuego has been this super aggro, very early game-focused team, and honestly, this has been a very early game snowball-focused meta at this tournament. Basically, everybody has been, well, we either get our gigantic lead in the early game or we lose. We don't really play well from behind. Fuego very much saying, screw that. We're going to pick Seraphine. We're going to pick Maokai. We're going to pick Jarvan. We're going to play for these front-to-back 5v5s, and we're going to try to get to the part of the game where you just cannot kill our frontline engage. And honestly, it ended up working out. That's not really something I expected, especially with them playing so passive in the early game. Not that I blame them for playing passive. That's the right thing to do in this instance. If you take fights, as they kind of found out around Rift Herald, you kind of just lose the game. Like, if you're actively giving free gold over to VKS, now all of a sudden your scaling advantage doesn't matter anymore. But if you are able to get to that part of the game post 20 minutes where Seraphine is online, where the healing is coming through, now all of a sudden you've got Locket on Maokai, you've got Jarvan diving in and being unkillable generally speaking, and you've got so many ways to set up for free damage in the back half of the game. And as long as Zelt actually does land his ultimates, which he was doing in pretty critical moments in this game, then you have a ton of ways to win fights super cleanly, even at gold disadvantages, which is exactly what happened. Player of the game simply has to go to Varus FX for me. There's no other way to look at this. The Seraphine was the core of this comp, and even if Mataz was kind of the one that broke open the game and really kind of expedited a lot of what was happening, he was the one making aggressive engages and plays down the stretch. I think that you have to say that Varus was the most relevant player in this game in general. I think the Seraphine was just too much to deal with. There was really no way to be able to stop it. He was playing so aggro in the back half of this game in terms of his positioning, which I really, really liked. I think overall, this is probably the most impressive game that Varus in particular has played at this tournament. I think bot laners, basically with the exception of Marvin, have taken more of a passive role at this tournament. Makes sense. Jhin, Ashe, a lot of these things are super popular and common right now and strong. And so, AD carry is not necessarily in positions, even Ziggs, right? Like AD carry is not necessarily in positions to be stars in the same way that jungle and mid have been at this tournament, but this was a really good game from Varus, and they really did play around him. But Mataz definitely deserves a big shout out as well. This wasn't just like a one-player comp. You don't just get Seraphine online and everybody else can't do anything. Like, you still have to execute on all the other champions that are doing stuff being enabled by Seraphine, and Mataz was back to his really aggressive self in the back half of this game. Typically speaking, I'm very scared about Mataz going into this role on the Jarvan where he just has to play super safe in the early game. You just don't really like that as an idea for Mataz, because that's very very, anti who he has been as a player. And so I was a bit worried when I saw this comp, and I'm like, well, you have to sack every single lane in the early game in order to really survive this game. The more you fight, the worse it's going to get. But he did that. He played low. He laid low in the early game. He played very slow, and all of a sudden you do get to that break point, and then he was allowed to kind of unleash the chains and take off the weight belts and kind of go all in on the crazy plays that he wanted to make on the Jarvan because he was unkillable down the stretch of this game. So Mataz, Varus definitely linking up. Zelt had some really, really crucial ults down the stretch here on the Yone. Yone continues, in my opinion, to be the strongest champion in the game. Baula, ADD, they were also fine. ADD, less relevant, I would say, in this game on the Udyr, but overall just a good game from Fuego and a necessary win to keep their hopes alive in this tournament. But for VKS, they just couldn't quite capitalize on enough of the early game lead that they had. They couldn't stop the inevitability that was Fuego in this game. I think Kisei did a really good job of being really active in the early game on the Akali. He was able to get a ton done. Basically pre-15 minutes, it looked like it was just going to be another one of those games where Kisei gets super fed as the singular member on VKS, and they're able to snowball that out of control into a victory. That's been their most reliable win condition, but the Akali just didn't have enough pressure in the back half of the game. There was no way that she could dive onto the backline and blow up the Seraphine by the time we actually hit our power spikes, and that kind of compounded with the fact that Nocturne just was not useful in this game. So Rolu is going to get dud of the game for me in the jungle. I don't like Nocturne very much as a pick. I've talked about this quite a bit over the course of this year. I think generally speaking, that champion, at a best case scenario, dives in, kills one person, and trades 1-for-1. I don't think that that's particularly valuable, and especially if you're going into a comp that's entire purpose is to scale into an unkillable monster down the stretch, picking a double assassin on R4, it just doesn't feel like the right decision in my eyes. Maybe they just wanted to go for something that they felt could have prio, but Nocturne's already not unbelievably good at ganking pre-6. He's not this ridiculous early game jungler. I just don't think the Nocturne pick was valuable at all in this game, and I think it got punished really hard by Fuego. And then I also think, of course, that you can talk about the rest of this team just not being aggressive enough. Morteus was generally, irrelevant in this game. I think that that's fine. I honestly don't even think he made any bad decisions, but it's just really hard for Jhin to do anything in this matchup. Telos couldn't get in on the Nautilus. Even if he did, what's he going to do? Tyrion can't actually tank the front line here because Jarvan is unkillable, and so he's just going to outlast the Gnar. You just don't have enough damage to actually break through here. You certainly can't win any front-to-back 5v5s with the double assassin middle of the map, and that really, really cost you. I think you got to get back to basics. You've got to be able to play this early game style, but that can actually translate. I think the Ezreal was good for that. The Akali, maybe not so much, even if Kisei's really good at it. Going for something that is a little bit more of a hyper carry in the back half of the game, I think is going to be valuable for VKS. But for Fuego, you got to keep the pressure on. This was a great win, but your tournament life is still on the line. This is winner take all. The winner moves on to the semifinals. The loser is eliminated. Who's it going to be? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Fuego. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to take this series 2-1, and they will be moving on to the semifinals, the lower bracket finals of America's Challengers, and that means the number 1 seed from CB LOL Academy has been eliminated in 4th place. That means the number 1 seed from both CB LOL Academy and from the NACL, neither of them made top 3. That is genuinely insane. It also guarantees that we have 3 different regions in the top 3. This is basically everything that we could have wanted from this tournament. We wanted to see every region show up. We wanted to see everyone represented in a positive light, and that is exactly what has happened. Everybody has looked good at parts of this tournament, and Fuego especially have looked like they have a great grasp on not only what they are very individually good at, but also what is very strong in the meta, maybe a bit underplayed in the meta right now. VKS continuing to try to go for these really risky, aggressive, I don't want to say assassin-oriented comps, because I don't quite think that, Azir, Kai'Sa is, not a front-to-back 5v5 comp. You can absolutely dominate front-to-back 5v5s with Azir Kai'Sa, but going for things like Rengar in the jungle and getting heavily punished for it, not having the same kind of consistency that you need in the later half of these games to hang on to any sort of aggressive plays that you want to make. Fuego just being better at capitalizing on their own read of the meta. Player of the game in game number 3 is going to go to ADD. It's got to go to ADD in the top lane. This Shen was uncounterable. Kind of what we talked about for Varus on the Seraphine in game 2. that sometimes a champion can just completely warp how the enemy team is able to play the game, and the moment this Shen is locked in on R5, this game becomes infinitely harder, because even if Sorolu is able to get some advantages in the bot lane early on in the game, the Rengar can't actually do anything the longer this game goes on, because the moment that Shen hits level 6, all of a sudden, now any play that the Rengar tries to make, any aggressive sort of engage, Shen is immediately there to counter it and completely shut it down, and the game is over for VKS, even if they are able to try to get off some of these front-to-back engages, which they were able to do when Morteus actually did start popping off in some of the fights at the end of the game. You just don't have the consistency, and if you don't have every tool at your disposal, then Fuego actually does have the ability to force you into those fights at bad timings, and all of a sudden the game is over. The Viego is able to start it, the Viego is able to finish it, and, you know, Orianna does a ton of damage. Like, this is generally just a great example of how to execute a comp like this and how to shut down a very volatile comp that VKS ended up drafting and really getting punished for. Like I said, ADD player of the game, because I do think that his individual plays were very strong, but really he's getting this because Shen just completely, like I said, shut down the Rengar, shut down the Azir, in a lot of instances made the Ornn almost entirely irrelevant throughout this game, which we will definitely talk about, but the Shen, really the crux point of Fuego and really what they played around, but Mataz and Zelt continue to really be stars in the middle of the map. Zelt did like 40k damage in this game on Orianna. I will continue to die on this hill. Everybody's talking about Storm Surge Syndra. We're seeing it a lot in solo queue. You know, solo queue and in-houses, especially public ones, they're not great examples of what we're going to see at, like, future tournaments. A lot of people are talking about Syndra as this gigantic pick for Worlds. I'm really not sold on that. I think we might see it a lot at the beginning, but Orianna, to me, just seems like kind of a better version or a more consistent version of Syndra at the current moment. You can still build very aggressively on Orianna, and you get a lot of the utility that you're not getting out of Syndra. I think she pairs up with a lot of the other junglers that are popular right now, or might rise into popularity a bit better. I think, generally speaking, Ori is just incredibly undervalued by the community. I don't think she's going to be undervalued by pros. I think she is going to be recognized as one of the strongest champions in the middle of the map right now, and I think Zelt just kind of proving that here in game number 3. You can do an absolute boatload on this champion. You don't need to be playing something like Syndra with Storm Surge in order to do 40k damage in a game like this. Mataz continues to be excellent. He's actually going to get my player of the series as a whole. He just continues to be the engine that kind of drives Fuego throughout a lot of these games. The Viego is kind of a signature pick of his at this point. The resets that he's able to get, the aggressiveness that he plays his champion with, it almost always ends up working out, and pairing that up with Shen and Orianna just makes him impossible to deal with. Baula had a great series and has underratedly been having a pretty great tournament. Virus we called out for that great Seraphine game, but was still very good on the Draven, basically the opposite style here in game 3. Overall, Fuego earned this victory. We didn't expect a lot of the LatAm teams to come into this tournament and actually perform up to the level of Brazil and of North America, but Fuego is proving that very, very wrong. They are living up to every super team expectation that people had on them going into this tournament. But for VKS, pretty sad way to go out. I think you definitely thought you were going to do better, especially because you once again were the only team to take a win off of Pain in the main group stage. It felt like you kind of had their number, and that this was a tournament that you could win at home as the defending champions, but it just didn't end up working out like that. I hate their drafts in both games 2 and 3. I think, you know, Nocturne is kind of a troll pick. Rengar, in my opinion, is even more of a troll pick. I get that it's probably comfort for Sorolu as a player, and when you get into these situations where it's do or die in a tournament setting, like, comfort, I think, is definitely the way to go, but man, Rengar did absolutely nothing. Like, he got a bit of gold on a Kai'Sa in the early game, and then all of a sudden he completely disappeared from the map and was never allowed to play again. I think this is just such an absolute throw in draft, in my opinion. I think this champion is unplayable in matchups like this. I think Kissei had probably his worst game of the tournament. He actively is playing LEC Azir. I talk about this a lot. If you're not familiar, when I say like LEC Azir syndrome, that means that instead of playing Azir as a champion that does a lot of damage and is really good in team fights, you play him as like full engage Azir, where you have to Shreem and shuffle the start of every single fight, where you have to dive into the backline and try to be the hero. I think oftentimes, I call it LEC Azir syndrome because you see a lot of LEC mids do this. Like, it's basically, you know, a brain condition over in Europe at the moment. But this is the worst way to play Azir consistently. And I think Kissei ran into probably the worst game that he has played because of just trying to do too much throughout a lot of the middle of this game. Tyrion's going to get dud of the game on the top side on the Ornn. Name me one play where the Ornn was relevant throughout this entire game. Shen was everywhere, constantly blowing up every single play that VKS could potentially want to make with his infinite map pressure and his genuine, like, crazy amount of damage, like actually like good trading power. What did Ornn do? Like, where was the Ornn throughout this game? Tyrion was completely invisible, completely irrelevant. It's got to be one of these 3 players that gets dud of the game for game 3, but I think all 3 of them ended up playing really poorly. Morteus was trying his best to 1v5 at the end of the game. He actually got one really, really good fight off, and it kind of looked like VKS, even at their lowest, was potentially going to position themselves to get back into the game, but like I said, Fuego kind of recognizing that they needed everything to do it, all the sums available to them. Mataz kind of making that engage at the end of the game when they knew that all of them were down for VKS, and that just kind of shuts the door on any sort of comeback that VKS could potentially want to make. But it's not against Morteus, who I thought was pretty good in this game. Telos was good in this series, but, you know, VKS unfortunately is going to be the team going out in 4th place, and, you know, I'm sure their expectations were higher than this, like I said, but hopefully they don't worry about it too much. I still think this was an okay performance at the tournament, but this has been a genuinely phenomenal performance from Fuego, and honestly, you know, who's to say they can't continue this? They were the number 2 seed. Who's to say that this team can't win in the semifinals against either Pain or Fear and move on to the grand finals of the entire tournament? But then moving on to our second series here of this video, and it is the winners finals of the entire tournament. The winner of this series will be moving on to the grand finals. The loser will move down to the lower bracket finals, the semifinals, if you will, to take on Fuego. It's a matchup between the number 1 seeded Pain Academy and the number 3 seeded Fear x Starforge. Both of these teams were the teams we expected to see here in the winners finals, once the bracket was announced at the very least, once Dragonsteel ended up falling out. In the group stage, I think these were clearly the 2 best teams left in the tournament, and they very much have lived up to that expectation. Pain very much taking care of Vivo Cade Stars in round number 1, kind of their kryptonite over the course of the last couple of months. They obviously lost to them in the finals in a series that was very close, but really kind of came down to full Fearless, and I think generally Pain still kind of walked out of that feeling like the better team, as I've talked about a lot in this tournament so far. And, you know, obviously they lost to VKS again in the group stage at this tournament, but got their revenge with a 2-0 win in round 1. And then you have Fear x Starforge, who is very much coming in with a bit of a different vibe. We talked about it kind of the opposite way around in the previous series, where Fuego was coming in with a lot of confidence where VKS wasn't, because, you know, Pain kind of obliterated them. Well, Fear very luckily, I think, lucked out a win against Fuego in round number 1. They get that game 1 win basically off the back of a fantastic teleport flank from Philip on the Olaf. They end up getting a quadra kill and insta end the game, even though they're down like 5k gold or something like that in that fight. And then obviously game 2 doesn't go their way because they lose early and they kind of get destroyed in that game. They end up winning game 3 pretty decisively, but it's not like Fear looked dominant coming into this series. It's not like this was a team that was on fire. They had lost both of their final 2 games of the group stage on the final day and barely eked out a win in round number 1. They are certainly not coming in with the same kind of momentum that a team like Pain currently has, who, at least over the course of this tournament, has looked like the best team here. And so Pain is a lot of people's favorites going into this series. I have to imagine that Fear is going to be able to get their shit together. On paper, they should be the best team left at the tournament, and I have to kind of trust my gut. Maybe that's the NA bias coming in, but Fear should be the best team left at the tournament, and so I'm going to expect them to be. I think when you're talking about playstyles, Pain can play through a variety of different lanes. I think the player that has stood out for me the most has been Hidan at this tournament so far. I think he has been exceptional in the top lane. Top has generally been a pretty feast or famine position at this tournament. A lot of good plays and a lot of bad plays from even good teams. Hidan has really been the exception to that. He has basically exclusively been a positive player for Pain over the course of the beginning part of this tournament. But obviously, it's not just Hidan. Marvin, I think, has had a great tournament. Tatu, I think, has had a great tournament. Kotz, I thought, played really well in round 1. Geeks, I think, has been a really big help in setting up a lot of these plays. I think Pain, in general, just looks good across the board. But for Fear, obviously, this is a very middle-of-the-map focused team, very similar to how we talked about both Fuego and VKS in the previous matchup, where jungle mid is really going to determine kind of how well this team is able to operate. XU is so important, basically the most important player in the entire tournament in terms of how the early game goes. When XU is playing well, when he is able to generate leads, Fear is often just able to translate those leads and resources into winning situations around a Blaze Olive, typically on hyper carries in the mid lane. But when XU isn't doing particularly well in the early game, this team can sometimes struggle to be able to maintain the same kind of pressure in 5v5s or 4v4s. Now, they did look really good in even-numbered fights in the previous series against Fuego. That's really where they were getting their advantages. They were kind of getting pulled apart in a couple of different areas at the beginning of that series, but the moment they could lock in and actually just take a 4v4 4v4 or a 5v5, they were often winning those. And so I still have a lot of faith that Fear is good enough to be able to move on, but Pain definitely in better form coming into this series. That makes it very, very intriguing. This could be a preview of a potential finals matchup between two of probably the best teams at the tournament. So how did it go? Well, the only way to find out is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Fear x Starforge. They are going to take game number 1 in this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is a gigantic win, especially with the way that they were able to win this game. On paper, it does look like a game that, yes, it went 40 minutes. Yes, it was a bit back and forth, but Fear, they got a pretty big gold lead. They're in a pretty decent position. They were able to take a lot of towers. They were able to get a lot of objectives. The Smolder looks like it got super online. This was probably a pretty standard kind of late game scaling comp game for Fear, right? No, that was not the case at all. I mean, they did scale into the late game, and they did end up taking it because of that, but Pain had a gigantic lead in the early game here. They were able to come out to this gigantic early gold lead, mostly off the back of the top side of the map. Tatu kind of getting really fed on the Kindred, or at least getting quite a few stacks on the Kindred, and Hidan really setting up a ton of plays for Pain, and unfortunately for Pain, they just couldn't hold on to that lead. It was small play after small play. It was great engage and well-timed play after well-timed play for Fear that ended up getting them back into this game. All of a sudden, Smolder has hit his stack limit, Instinct is doing a ton of damage on the Ziggs, and XU is the most aggressive player in the game, and they are now, playing from a gold lead, and the entire gold mountain has essentially flipped on its head. It's very, very fun to watch and to see, because specifically, Fear really struggled at the end of games towards the end of the group stage. Remember, when they lost both of those games on the final day, in day number 3, they were 45 minute plus games that they ended up losing that they just couldn't quite hold on to, and this is a really good example that even if they do go down in the early game, they still have enough talent and still have enough in the tank to be able to win it. Kind of reminds me of game number 1 in the previous series, except this one was a lot cleaner, and I think it was even pretty clean from Pain. Fear was just straight up better, so player of the game is going to go to XU. He was awesome in this one. Really no negative things to say about XU down the stretch. I think his early game could have been better. I guess that's the one critique that I could possibly give him. Early game has been kind of his specialty throughout this year, and so to see him struggle a bit at playing against the Kindred early on in this matchup, I don't think was ideal, but a lot of the trigger pulling down the stretch, it was XU that was diving in and getting on priority members. He was setting up a lot of the key fights, and he clearly was the most important player, I would say, on Fear, but you certainly don't want to take anything away from a Blaze Olive either on the Smolder. Setup's great, like having really good setup from the Vi and from the Alistair and even from the Mordekaiser to a smaller extent. It's important and it matters, but if you don't have something that can capitalize on it, if you don't have a damage dealer that can pop off in these team fights and just run the damage charts, then none of that ends up being as relevant. Luckily, Blaze Olive was on one of his traditional hyper carries in the Smolder in this one. I've been hearing a lot of talk about how mages are going to be the only thing we're seeing in the mid lane on 14-18, and that hyper carries are actually out of the meta. Things like Smolder are not good anymore. I don't really know where anyone is getting that impression. Smolder is still in a really, really strong spot, and I think this champion is still going to be very effective if you are able to hit the breakpoints. I get that his early game isn't quite as consistent, but he's still Smolder once you hit 225 stacks. Like, he still is going to do the most damage in the game if you can get him to that breakpoint, and a Blaze Olive proved that once again here. Instinct had a very weird game, ends up being down like 6 tower plates to the Jhin throughout a majority of this game, and yet still does a ridiculous amount of damage and is very relevant. Kind of the anti-Ziggs game coming out from him on Ziggs. Winsome was good. Philip was good. I don't love the Mordekaiser pick. It's kind of an NA special. Players like Impact have been picking this for a long time, but I don't know if Mord kind of does the thing that I would want it to do in this game. Again, I'm just not a huge fan of the champ, but I do think it ended up working out here, even if Hidan was more relevant in the early part of the game. Fear just generally keeping their wits about them and not panicking, not freaking out when they were at a deficit, which I think Fear would have done earlier on in the year. This was a really good sign for them, but for Pain, just a couple of small mistakes down the stretch that end up taking this gigantic gold lead and throwing it back in their face. Dud of the game is unfortunately going to go to Tatu. This was a bit of a jungle gap down the stretch. Him getting caught out pretty much sealed the game, I would say, here for Fear. There was a pivotal fight where the Kindred just is way too far forward, and all of a sudden Tatu is dead. A lot of their damage is gone, and they're just not able to contest anything from that point onwards, and that basically threw away the entire game for Pain. I'm not going to blame the entire game on Tatu. I think that there were things that could be done better from other players. Geegs was constantly looking for these flank angles and constantly getting spotted out. Fear did a great job trying to track the Rel and make sure that she was not in positions to be able to blow up a lot of these team fights. Kotz just wasn't playing particularly safe. he again kind of suffered from that syndrome where just diving in on Azir feels like the right thing to do even when you've got a Cassante and you've got a Rel. You've got so much setup in this game, you don't need to be the hero on Azir, and unfortunately Kotz didn't quite get that memo. I do think Hidan played pretty well in this game, and generally speaking, I continue to be very impressed with how he plays out his early games. I think he's just a very intelligent player in terms of when he wants to be super aggressive, and I think Cassante is a very good champion for that style, but there's only so much you can do, like 1v9 on a Cassante, although there are definitely worse champions to be in that position. But when your jungler is just getting caught out, when your support is not necessarily finding any angles to actually engage, and you're constantly on the back foot in terms of man management in these fights, you're just in a bad spot. It's going to be really difficult to win. So for Pain, you're now down 0-1. You know, I think you had the formula here. Win in the early game. You just got to be more clinical and not making those mistakes to close it out. But for Fear, this has to be a gigantic confidence booster, especially coming off of that Fuego series where now you're like, okay, we actually can just win in a lot of different game states. And if we win early, it should be free. So really excited to see where the rest of this series goes. Fear could win game 2 and move on to finals, or Pain could tie us up and bring us to our second game number 3 of the day. Which will it be? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Pain Academy. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece. And we are going to a game number 3 once again for the second straight series here on the day. We are getting the max amount of games, and I am excited to be able to say that. This was a great game from Pain, a lot more cohesive, I would say, from start to finish. They didn't really give up a lot of the mistakes that they gave up in game number 1, and I think that they were a lot cleaner in terms of their execution. For Fear on the other side, I think Cubby put it really well on the broadcast. I do think that there are some flaws in this draft. I don't think this is some sort of unwinnable draft by any means. I think if you are able to get this gigantic gold lead, there are a lot of ways to play out this game, but the problem is you didn't really have that gold lead, and the moment that you start to lose out on that in the early game, the moment that Kalista in particular starts to get rolling and that Aurelion Sol starts to get online, and particularly Lilia gets behind, that's when things start to fall apart for this comp, and unfortunately they really had no way to get back into the game. So let's go ahead and talk about it. For Pain, player of the game was actually kind of difficult. I think this was very much a team effort from Pain in terms of picking up the win. I think everybody kind of pulled their part here, did their job in the win, but Kotz is going to get it for me on the Aurelion Sol. It just felt like that champion was the most relevant throughout the game. Not only did it feel like if a Sol ever did get online, it was just going to be a bit of a, okay, well, now the game is over. It's going to invalidate a lot of the other, parts of this game, but also I think generally Aurelion Sol does very well in terms of his utility in a game like this. Sol has always been a very good pick into things like Lilia because he slows, and Lilia obviously can't really do her thing if she's slowed down. Her whole thing is that she moves really fast, and when Lilia isn't actually able to play the game, Fear's comp becomes basically impossible to execute in the early game. So Aurelion Sol actually does quite a bit for this team, and obviously the damage in the later half of the game was gigantic. He ends up leading the entire game in damage. Kotz once again was just very good here for Pain. I want to give a big shout out to Marvin and Geegs down in the bot lane as well. The Nautilus, very relevant throughout the entirety of this game. I do think that having a go button, like an actual, real go button for Pain was a big difference maker here. Fear just don't really have that. You're kind of relying on Lilia being super fed and being able to kind of duck and dive out of the fight, or Renekton being able to dive into the backline to be able to start anything in the later half of the game because you don't have that real hard engage tool. But Nautilus very much gives, Pain that on the other side of this matchup, and Geeks very much used that well. I thought he had a great game. Marvin was obviously great. I honestly think he was a bit underrated for how good he was in this game on the Kalista. Kalista in general is a bit of an underrated pick right now. She is still very good in the early 2v2. Still the best champ in the game if you do want to try to dominate early. And even going into something like Misfortune, Kalista has so much priority in that matchup, I guess depending on the support. But even here, if you switch the supports, if this is Kalista Braum playing into Misfortune Nautilus, you're still looking at Kalista Braum being the favored 2v2 lane. Kalista really just is that good right now, and I don't think she, as a champion, is getting enough credit for that. And obviously Tatu was very good as well in the Sejuani. Going deathless on Sejuani and being the better jungler in a game like this, it's a pretty big deal. But overall, Pain, kind of a team effort to be able to push themselves above Fear, and this was obviously a pretty necessary win for them. But for Fear, we kind of already talked a bit about some of the weaknesses that I think they fell into here in game number 2. I think you're talking about the fact that this team doesn't really have that go button. You don't have a Nautilus. You don't really have Rakan was on the table, but I understand why this feels like a pretty impossible Rakan game to try to play. Overall, I just think think the Braum on R5 wasn't necessarily what I personally would have went for. It's just a bit of a different circumstance, and obviously picking Hui on R4, Hui was basically irrelevant throughout this game. I think Hui is a bit underpowered at the current moment, even if there are some good parts of his game. Lilia, I think, has run into some troubles. XU is actually going to get my dud of the game for the game as a whole, because really him being taken out of it and him not really being able to contribute all that much in the mid game was kind of what separated Pain and allowed them to play so freely and allowed them to play around a lot of their, positive objectives as easily as they wanted to. XU just didn't really have a presence in this game, and a part of that was his play. I think part of it was the champion just generally in this matchup, as we've already talked about, but him not being there was a huge issue for Fear. I think Philip didn't really get to do anything. He is also a potential go button if you find these ridiculous flanks, but that's not really an efficient or reliable way of being able to fight in a lot of these late games. Overall, I just think there were too many flaws in Fear's game, and not only were there flaws in the draft, but they ended up executing it a little bit worse than Pain anyways, and so you've just got to put that behind you. Again, this team has already shown that when they're on the back foot, they can rebound and they can come back and, play these games well, but it is do or die. It's game number 3. The winner of this game moves on to finals. The loser moves down into the semifinals. A big one here for both of them, but only one can take it. Who will it be? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Pain Academy. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to take this series 2-1, and they will be moving on to the grand finals of America's Challengers of this entire tournament, and they have earned it. They have been the best team at this tournament by a pretty considerable margin at this point. Fear definitely felt like a team that should be able to compete with them, and they did throughout this series. I certainly don't want to make it seem like Fear was bad at all in this series. Game 1 was a great performance from Fear, not only in their win, but just a great back and forth between these two teams. It kind of did show that they are the highest level of competition so far at this tournament, but even in this loss, they had moments where it felt like they could stay in the game. XU was exceptionally good on the Nidalee. This was a phenomenal Nidalee performance, and it just didn't end up mattering because they didn't have pressure elsewhere on the map. We'll talk about it, but for Pain, they really are just such a cohesive group of 5. All 5 of these players are stepping up and playing great right now. It's not like some of the other teams at the tournament where you're talking about a couple of players stepping up and a couple of players kind of just being a part of the ride. No offense to Fuego, no offense to VKS. You're talking about, Matas for Fuego. You're talking about Kise for VKS. You're not talking about one player for Pain. This has been an everybody effort. This has been everybody stepping up and everybody looking great. Player of the game and player of the series for me is going to go to Marvin. I understand why it goes to Hedon on the broadcast. I think Hedon had an excellent game, and we will talk about that. But I think when you're looking at both games 2 and 3, Marvin was the one constant for me where it's this guy's hands are just ridiculous. I get that there is still a lot to learn for him about where to be in the early game, but you want to talk about legit just mechanics. I've talked about it the entire tournament. Marvin has blown me away in terms of what his raw mechanics look like. This is a player that I think is good enough to be playing in the CB LOL, near the top of it right now. Pain Gaming is going to Worlds, and I think Marvin is near the level of Titan in terms of what I have seen mechanically. Now, obviously, the entire game is harder to evaluate in terms of just this small sample size, and I'm sure that there is a reason that Marvin is, still down here, and, as a young player, I'm sure he has a lot to grow through, but man, have I been impressed with his consistency and his mechanics at this tournament, and I want to reward that with a player of the series here, because that Kalista game was great, and I think this Ezreal game was really great as well. Geeks was another player I was considering. This was a really great Karma game from him in game number 3. You just take away a lot of the options for Instinct and Winsome to be able to play through in the early game. It makes Leona's job significantly harder to be able to play out, and that's kind of the goal. Tatu and Hedon, we already talked about, were excellent. Hedon was phenomenal, just a pretty gigantic top gap. I don't mean this as a negative towards Philip, I really don't, but Hedon has been far and away the best top laner at this tournament. It's not even been remotely close. Hedon has just been exceptionally good. He's another player where you watch him in a tournament like this, and you're like, what is he doing down in tier 2? This guy's ridiculously good, and you want to see him get a shot in the CB LOL. I'm sure this tournament is going to raise his profile quite a bit because he was unbelievable. Tatu is this big prospect. I thought the Skarner was excellent here. Kotz was great throughout the series, very consistent. I thought the Aesol was definitely more of a standout than the Orianna, but still good overall. Pain just looked great across the board. There was almost no notes for me to give. I would like to see them be more consistent at playing from behind, but even then, this was one of those performances where XU was playing well in Italy in the early game, and yet you were still sitting there saying, we have enough tools to be able to win all of our fights in the back half, and we can rely on that, and they did exactly that. We can set up for the Ezreal, we can have Gnar everywhere on the map, and we can just make this super easy, and that's, the kind of execution you want to see from the top team at America's Challengers. This was an unbelievable series and a great game number 3 for Pain, and they deserve to be going to the finals. But for Fear, I still feel good about them. I know that feels weird coming out of a series like this because, I was talking about them as favorites and they ended up losing, and that should, naturally feel a bit disappointing, but I think the way that they played really was not all that bad. I think that there were a lot of encouraging traits to take away from some of these games, some negative ones as well, especially here in game number 3. XU was phenomenal in this game on the Nidalee. I think he did most damage on his team. I think he was close to most damage in the entire game. That's really not something that should be acceptable on Nidalee. It just goes to show how much prio and pressure he had throughout this entire game, but the rest of the team unfortunately just didn't have that. We already talked about Instinct and Winsome just not really being able to play the game against the Karma Ezreal. Blazolov, I think, had one of his weaker games of the entire tournament here on the Lucian. He just never really was able to get going in the early or in the mid game when that champ is supposed to be able to take over and match Nidalee's pressure, and then Philip, I think, really struggled in this one. He's going to get dud of the game. This was just a bad performance. It's one of his weaker ones in quite a while. It kind of reminds me of the finals against Dragonsteel, where he just wasn't really able to compete with a top laner who was being really aggressive and moving around the map. It just feels like Philip is not necessarily locked in that regard when he's playing against somebody who is playing really well. Like, we've seen great performances out of Philip. He got player of the series for me in round number 1 against Fuego, but it just didn't work out here. He's going to have a couple of bad games every so often, and that's what I'm talking about when I talk about top lane being so volatile at this tournament. You're still going to get good performances out of Philip, but it makes what Hidan is doing so special because he has been so consistent, and he's been so good throughout basically every game of this entire tournament. So for Fear, I think they're going to be just fine. They get their rematch with Fuego down in the semifinals. Fuego has a chance to prove that they should have won in round number 1. Fear has a chance to prove that even though they were gifted that first win in a best of 5, they are the more consistent team. Obviously, Fear has quite a bit of experience going deep in these full Fearless best of 5s. We'll see if that ends up playing a big factor for them, but I'm excited to see where that goes, and Pain is going to be meeting the winner of that series in the finals. Man, am I excited to see how that ends up going. I'm excited to see Pain in a best of 5, a full Fearless best of 5, because generally that was kind of their kryptonite. That was their weakness. That was the reason they lost to VKS in the CBLOL Academy finals, was they just didn't have a deep enough champion pool to go all 5 games. We'll see if that translates or if that changes, but let's be honest, we're not going to be surprised at all if this is a finals preview here in Winners Finals. All right, but that is going to do it for my America's Challengers round number 2 overview and analysis video. Our final 3 teams remain. We know our first team in the finals in Pain Academy. We know our 2 teams fighting it out in the semifinals in FearX, Starforge, and Fuego. Very excited to see how this ends up going. Of course, tomorrow's games or today's games as this is coming out. I think the series is happening as I'm speaking. That's just going to be the best of 5 between Fear and Fuego. Excited to see how that ends up going. Of course, previewing that, we kind of saw that in round number 1. We saw a best of 3 where, Fuego probably should have walked away with a 2-0, but they gave him that game number 1 and couldn't quite get the job done in game 3. I think Fear is going to be going in expecting to win. Fuego, I think, is going to be going in expecting to win. Both of these teams, I think, have a real shot of being able to move on to the finals, but as I said, I think Fear should be favorited in this series. I think that they are the better team at the current moment, and kind of disregarding what we saw at the beginning of that series, I think that they are in better form now than they were going in to that series against Fuego. I think we should be getting a Pain Fear rematch, and I'm really excited to see if that comes true. But again, Fuego's kind of got fire right now. They've been the underdogs throughout this entire tournament. Everybody has counted them out, and here they are sitting in the semifinals. They just need to win one more in order to get to the finals and be a top 2 team and knock NA out of this tournament as essentially the worst performing of the 3 major groups. So, we'll see how it ends up going. I'm excited to see. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about America's Challengers, although we will be posting about the final 2 series, both of the best of 5s. But of course, we're also doing Worlds coverage. The meta report came out a couple of days ago, and today, later on in the day, we're going to have my top 20 players at Worlds video come out. It's going to be very controversial. You guys are going to hate it, so tune in so you can hate comment me down in the comment section of that video. If you're interested in all that stuff, hit subscribe and hit the bell so you can be notified when all of those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all